Today we're continuing a discussion that we started last week where we're talking about this thing that we do every week in response to the sermon. Because if you've been coming to Hub City for a while, you know that every week we do this practice, this sacrament that we call communion. But what we discovered is that most of us have an understanding of communion that's kind of partial. Especially if you grew up in church, and if you grew up in a Baptist church, you have one understanding of communion. If you grew up in a high church, like a Lutheran or an Episcopal church, you have a different understanding of communion. And then if you grew up Catholic, your understanding of communion is totally different. And so what we've been trying to do for the past last week and this week is give ourselves a fuller understanding of what this practice really is according to the New Testament. And the reason why this is so important is because Jesus issued a command. It's a command that's found in all four of the Gospels. It happened on his last night before he was executed. He's eating dinner with the disciples, and he says this: "Do this in remembrance of me." Now remember, the this in that statement that Jesus makes is the covenant meal that he's having with the disciples. We're going to talk about that today. It happened in the context of this Passover meal. So they're eating together. And he says, as you're doing this, as you're eating together in community, do this in remembrance of me. But that phrase, in remembrance of me, doesn't just talk about remembering back to Jesus' death, which is what most of us think about with communion, right? We remember that Jesus died on the cross for us, and that's important. But that phrase, in remembrance of me, is talking about a whole bunch more. It's talking about us looking back to the past to remember not just Jesus' death, but his life and his teaching and his miracles and his kingdom work, and yes, his death and his resurrection and his ascension, but all of the Gospels, all of Jesus' life and ministry. We're to look back. We're also, in remembrance of me, Jesus reminds us to look forward to the future, to his promised return. Remember, Jesus said, I'm going to come back one day. But not only do we look to the past and look to the future, but we actually actualize that Jesus is present with us here and now, in the here and now. Can you just let that sink in for just a minute? I know we say, oh yeah, Jesus is with us. But do you realize that Jesus is actually with us right now? That is a little overwhelming for me to think about. He's with us in this time and in this place and in this space. He knows what you came in here with. But as we do this in remembrance of him, we're looking to the past, we're looking to the future, and we're recognizing that he is with us in the here and the now. And we've said that this act, this sacrament that we call communion, is actually a microcosm of all of our theology, of what we believe as followers of Jesus, and what's called our orthopraxy, which is how we live out what it is that we believe. We don't just believe things about Jesus, but what we believe about Jesus should impact how we live for Jesus, right? And in this sacrament, we get a little picture, a microcosm of all of that. And to guide us, we've been looking at the 5 different names that the New Testament uses to talk about communion. This is them: communion, the breaking of bread, Eucharist, agape, love feast, and the Lord's Supper. We looked at the first 3 last week, right? We talked about communion. We said that when we eat the bread and we dip it in the juice, we remember that we are communing with Jesus and we are to commune with one another. We are a part of a body. The bread comes from one loaf, and we are a part of one body, just like this bread is a part of one loaf. And we are in this together with others. It's not just about us and God. It's about us and God and us and one another. We are a part of a body. That's communion. We talked about the breaking of bread, how Jesus' body was broken for us, but how we, in response to that, should offer up our bodies to be broken for other people. We should offer up our bodies to be servants for other people, to be in service to other people, to sacrifice ourselves for other people. And then last week we talked about that third name, the Eucharist, which just means the Thanksgiving meal. It's the most popular name for this sacrament all around the world today. And the Eucharist reminds us that we are to be thankful, not just when we eat the bread and the juice, but we are to have lives that are permeated with gratitude. And we have so much to be thankful for. We're thankful for what Jesus has done. We're thankful for what he is doing. We're thankful for the good stuff. We're thankful for the bad stuff. We're thankful for the ugly stuff, because Paul says, in all things, give thanks. Don't give thanks for all things, but in all things, give thanks. We have so much to be thankful for, to be grateful for. That's the Eucharist. That's where we've been since last week. But today we're going to look at these last two names, the agape or the love feast, and the Lord's Supper. And then we're going to talk about what this means for us as a church family. So let's talk about the agape or the love feast. The reason this is called the agape/love feast is because the Greek word agape actually means unconditional love. Most of you guys have heard that before, right? It's the kind of love that God has for us. But be honest, when you think of the love feast, that sounds a bit sketchy, doesn't it? You know what I mean? It sounds a bit sketchy. In fact, it sounded extremely sketchy in the early church life, because people accused the early church of all kinds of horrible things in related to the love feast, which I'm not going to mention in here because we have children in the room. But this name, agape feast or the love feast, it's only used one time in the New Testament. And it's used in the book of Jude. I don't know if you've ever read the book of Jude before. It's just one chapter. It's really, really short. But it's writing, kind of rebuking some false teachers. And in this rebuke of false teachers, Jude, who, by the way, was Jesus' half-brother, Jude, he writes this. He says, "These people are blemishes at your love feasts, eating with you without the slightest qualm, shepherds who feed only themselves." See, in that context, some false teachers had infiltrated the church, and they were just horrible people. They were taking advantage of widows. They were taking advantage of the church. They were, spouting out all of these lies. And he says they show up at your love feast. But even though this is the only time this is used in the New Testament, in the early church fathers and the early church mothers, they used this phrase all the time to talk about what we call communion. In fact, it was the second most popular word for this sacrament besides the Eucharist in the first few hundred years of the church family. And in the love feast or the agape feast, we remember something. We remember that we have something to celebrate. See, the love feast is this party. It's not just a meal. It's not just something that we eat together, but it's a celebration. It's a party. Now think about this. Pretty much all cultures have special days of celebration. Some of you guys know that I grew up in Germany for 6 years of my life, and one thing I've learned about the Germans is they look for any and every opportunity to have, right, Mark, to have a holiday for a celebration. They just do. They have way more holidays than all of us. We have a few special holidays or things that we celebrate with a meal here in our country, like the Thanksgiving meal, obviously. You've got Easter dinner or Easter lunch, Christmas dinner. You've got a wedding reception. You've got an anniversary dinner, a birthday party. These are all celebrations that happen because something good has happened. Right? You have a party because something good has happened. And that is exactly what's going on here in the early church. See, they were celebrating all that Jesus had done for them, all that Jesus had done in them, all Jesus had promised them. They came together to celebrate, but something happened after a few hundred years of church history. See, the love feast eventually turned into a sacrament. And it became this somber and introspective and sober and individualized practice. But originally, it was a party. It was a feast. It was crazy. In fact, the reason why we know that is because in the longest section in the New Testament that talks about this practice, this sacrament, in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul has to get on to the Corinthians because people were getting drunk at the love feast. We've solved that with those little bitty cups. If you use those, nobody's getting drunk on that, even if it was wine. I know some of you kids, you steal those little cups. I know that. I've watched that. But the thing is, it was a party. It was this celebration. But what originally began as this celebratory event, this celebration meal, has turned into today this private and solemn event. And don't hear what I'm not saying. There's time for solemnness. There's time for quiet introspection. There's time for us to reflect on our sin and confess our sin and meditate on what Jesus did on the cross. That's important. But I want to show you something. You're supposed to do that before you come to this event. Look at what Paul writes. He says, everyone ought to examine themselves. What's that next word? What's the next word? Do you know what the word before means? Before. Like not at the event, but before you get to the event. Not at worship, but before you get to worship. So everyone ought to examine themselves before they eat the bread and drink the cup. And I know what some of you are thinking, well, that's like as I'm walking down front. Or maybe that's I bow my head right before I take communion and examine myself and stuff. But that's not what Paul is talking about here at all. Paul's not talking about right before you do this. He's talking about before you gather, before you come together to worship with your brothers and sisters, before you gather for this agape love feast. That is when you're supposed to examine yourself. Think about it this way. The love feast that Paul's writing to, remember, was a pretty rowdy experience because you had people getting drunk at it. You had people who were, eating way too much, and so there wasn't other food left over for other people. It was crazy. But just imagine that there are 50 or 60 rowdy Corinthians who are gathering in somebody's backyard. And the reason why they were gathering in somebody's backyard is because the houses were too small for them to fit in, and they didn't have church buildings, right? So they're gathering together. They've just been Christians for a few years, and they get together to celebrate the love feast. And Paul tells them in this verse that before you show up to that event on Sunday night, and it happened on Sunday night because Sunday was a work day, people got off work, and then they would gather together on Sunday evening. That before you show up on Sunday night for this gathering with your brothers and sisters who are followers of Jesus, before you show up for this love feast, then is when you need to examine yourself. Like before you come, you should take a little bit of time during the week. Take a little bit of time on Sunday morning before you come on Sunday night. Take a little bit of time. And that's when you should examine yourself. Maybe you should ask some questions like these. I love these questions. Do I have any sin that I need to confess? Is there anything in my life that's out of sync with my discipleship to Jesus? And am I in relational conflict with anyone else in the community? I love these questions. They're great examination questions. And if there's any sin, confess that before you get there. If your life is out of sync with following Jesus in any way, get things straightened out before you get there. If you have a relational conflict with somebody who's in your church community, take care of that before you get there. Which, by the way, Paul just stole from Jesus, because remember, Jesus said, if you're going to worship and you remember that you have something against your brother or your brother has something against you, go take care of that before you go to worship. Actually, don't show up at worship until you take care of relational conflict that you have with your brother or your sister. But after you do that, so you do all this stuff before, and then after you make things right, after the heaviness of repentance, after you do the hard work of repentance, that is when you can show up and celebrate. Why? Because you have something to celebrate. You're right with God. You're right with other people. Things are right in your heart. Things are right in your family. Things are right in your relationships. You have something to celebrate because you took care of all the stuff that wasn't right before you got there. That's why it can be a love feast, this agape feast, this party. We can celebrate now because we're right with God and we're right with the people in our lives, and all is right in the world again. And when everything's right, I can't think of a better time to have a party. That is what the love feast is all about. There's this quote that Philip Yancey writes where he talks about this. I'm going to show it to you. It's so great. He says this, this table is different. He's talking about this table, communion, do this in remembrance of me. This table is different. It isn't where sinners find Christ, but where sons and daughters celebrate being found. Maybe someday, instead of solemnly making our way to the tables, we should dance for joy. Maybe we should sing every born-again song we know. He goes on and says this. Maybe we should tell our homecoming stories and laugh like people who no longer fear death. maybe we should ask if anybody wants seconds and hold our little cups high to toast lost sinners found and dead brothers and sisters alive. I love that. Which is, by the way, when we practice this sacrament today, we're going to dance in the aisles coming down front. Just kidding. You're all white people, so that wouldn't work very well. But yes, I know that was offensive, wasn't it? It's true, though. I've seen videos of some of you people, but I love what he says there, because that's really the joy and the gratitude and the celebration, that kind of attitude that's found in this name, the love feast, the agape feast. So think about it. When you participate in this every week, you need to remember this is a time to celebrate. You also need to remember that there's probably some stuff you need to take care of before the celebration. It's this reminder that our lives each day should have time set aside for confession. I don't know if that's a regular part of your daily existence where you kind of ask God to search your heart and point out things in you, anything in you that you've done wrong. Actually, most of us don't need God to point out the things in us that we've done wrong. We know exactly what we've done wrong, right? But that we set aside time every day for confession. This little microcosm of the love feast reminds us to do that during the week so that we can come and celebrate that we have been forgiven, that we were once lost and we are now found, that we were once dead, but now we are alive in Jesus. So take care of that stuff before. Which, by the way, little side note, this wasn't in my notes, but I don't know if you realize this or not, but throughout church history, people have died over their belief about this practice that we call communion. Did you realize that? People have died about how they viewed baptism, like people who believed in infant baptism used to execute people who believed in immersion baptism and back and forth. You know, people died over believing that this was the literal blood and body of Jesus, or if it was just figurative and symbolic. Like this has been a divisive thing throughout church history. And that's one of the reasons why I think we've kind of made it so somber and individualized, and we have all our own opinions about how it should be. But I think we forget that the New Testament gives us this grander picture of this amazing sacrament. And I think that one of the things that we're really bad at, especially as American followers of Jesus who are of the Caucasian variety, like if you're like me, we're not good at celebrating a lot of times what Jesus has done. Worship for us is somber. So how can we make this a little more like a party? A little more like a party. Can you imagine? Like, I'm not going to church today. I'm going to party with my Christian friends. Remember what Jesus has done for me, because I have a lot to celebrate, because I took care of my stuff beforehand. Such good stuff. So that's that. The name, the love feast. I just think that's such a great name. Let's look at the fifth name, the final name, and that is the Lord's Supper. Most of you in here have heard that language before, and the reason why, it comes straight out of 1 Corinthians 11, Paul's most in-depth teaching on this practice in the New Testament. I just want to read to you some of what he says, starting in verse 20. He says, "So then, when you come together, it's not the Lord's Supper you eat, for when you're eating, some of you go ahead with your own private suppers." Like, if you have kids and you're getting ready to eat and you put everything on the table, and how many of you have ever had your kids just like dive in and start like be done with their meal before you even sit down to begin yours? You know what I mean? That's kind of what was happening here. And he says, as a result, one person remains hungry and another gets drunk. There it is. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? I love that. Or do you despise the church of God by humiliating those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? Certainly not in this matter. See, in Corinth, there were rich people and there were poor people, and they had all become followers of Jesus, and they were gathering together in these homes, and they were celebrating this love feast, this thing called the Lord's Supper. But the ones who had more just kind of ate the stuff, so that those who came in a little bit late or didn't have enough, they got pushed to the side, and maybe they didn't get any of the meal. And so Paul is kind of rebuking them on how flippantly they're taking this meal. And notice he says, you think you're eating the Lord's Supper, but you're not eating the Lord's Supper. You're doing something totally different. And I know there's so much in these verses, but there's one thing I really want you to notice. They were coming together to do something specific. What, according to this, were they coming together to do? Eat. They're coming together to eat. They weren't coming together to sing. They weren't coming together to listen to some teaching. Even though all of that was there, they were coming together to eat. See, for the first few hundred years of church history, this thing that we call communion was the center point of worship. Things switched after the Reformation, where preaching became the center point of worship. But it used to be that the table, the meal, was the center point of worship. It's fascinating. But Paul says, look, that stuff's important, but when you come together to eat this thing, it's the Lord's Supper. Now, there's a backstory to that phrase, the Lord's Supper, that I think most of us don't know about. And the backstory is this, that it takes us back to this idea from the ancient Near East of a covenant meal. Now, we don't do covenants anymore. The closest thing that we have to a covenant in our modern day society is a marriage, right? We have a marriage covenant. But even our marriage covenants are more of a contract than a covenant, right? If you're married, what did you sign? A marriage license, which was like a contract a little bit. And if you're rich, what do you sign? A prenup, right? It's a contract. Right? So this thing that even is kind of like a covenant, we don't have covenants in our modern day. And remember, this was way before modern legal system. This was way before any sort of contract law came about. But how things worked in the ancient world is that if you wanted to promise something to someone, if you wanted to enter into an agreement with someone, you would make a covenant with those people. And the way that you affirmed or ratified this covenant is that you would sacrifice an animal, which we don't do, right? We do have nice feasts and, we sacrifice pigs for barbecues and stuff. But you would sacrifice an animal together with you and the partner, and then you would eat that animal together as a way to ratify or to affirm the covenant that you were making with that other person. That was, the eating of the meal was like the signature on the dotted line. That is the context that Paul is thinking about when he's talking about the Lord's Supper. That's the type of covenant meal that Paul had in mind. And you know what? That's also the type of thing Jesus had in mind when he said, do this in remembrance of me. Because remember, that happened in the context of the Passover. And the Passover was a covenant meal. It was a reminder of what God had done to rescue his people out of slavery in Egypt, to build a relationship with them. He made a covenant with them. It was in the context of this covenant meal that Jesus gave us this sacrament. And so, with that covenant meal in mind, it's important for us to remember something. That the Lord's Supper isn't just a covenant meal. It is an opportunity for us to make an active recommitment to following Jesus every time we partake. I don't know if you grew up in like an old Baptist church, and they used to have an invitation at the end of the service, and they always gave you an opportunity to do 3 things, maybe 4 things. Give your life to Jesus, recommit your life to Jesus, especially if you went to a church camp. You always got hundreds of kids recommitting their life to Jesus because it was an emotional high. To surrender your life to ministry, to vocational service or whatever, and then to join the church. You had all these options, right? But we don't need an invitation to recommit our lives to Jesus. You know why? We have the Lord's Supper. And the Lord's Supper as a covenant meal is an opportunity each week for us to re-up our commitment to Jesus. For us to say, I'm all in with you, Jesus. For us to recommit to following Jesus. For us to recommit to laying aside our life in pursuing the life that he has for us. And Paul, he's addressing these Corinthians who are just doing crazy stuff at this meal. And he's like, this isn't the Lord's Supper that you're eating, because you have forgotten that when you come together, you are to be recommitting yourself to follow Jesus with your church family. See, for this to be the Lord's Supper, it has to be a covenant meal where we recommit ourselves once again to follow Jesus, where we recommit ourselves to leave behind our sin and in faith to trust in Jesus, where we recommit ourselves each and every week to accepting Jesus' invitation, as we read, or as I read to you out of Matthew 11, to take on his easy yoke and to walk side by side from him, living the life that he wants us to live. I love what John Mark Comer says about this. He says, when we eat and drink, we renew our covenant with God. We pledge ourselves to keep the covenant. It is a moment of rededication and recommitment in the context of the worship experience. We voice our commitment to live worthy of the gospel. We vow to take up our cross, call Jesus Lord, and follow him into the world as obedient servants. The supper is the ritual moment when we renew the covenant vow. I know that some of you remember your wedding vows, and then some of you that have been married a long time, you have this idea you want to renew your wedding vows, right? Every time we come to the table, it's an opportunity for us to renew our vows and recommit to following Jesus. I love that picture. I love that. Why? Because following Jesus isn't a one-time decision that you made sometime in the past at Vacation Bible School. Following Jesus is a decision that you have to make every single day. And this sacrament just reminds us of that. Remember, it's a microcosm of how we should live out our faith. And as we recommit to follow Jesus as we're eating the bread and the juice, we are reminded to wake up Monday morning and recommit our lives to follow Jesus. We're reminded to recommit our lives to following Jesus on Tuesday and on Wednesday and throughout the rest of the week. It's an active recommitment. And that's why I like that there's a seriousness to this time, but not a bad seriousness, a good seriousness. Like if you sign a contract on something, like if you've ever signed a contract on a house, or a car, there's a seriousness to that moment. You know why? Because you know that payments are coming after you sign your name. There's a weightiness to that. Jesus said, count the cost before you follow me. Why? Because there's a weightiness, a seriousness to following Jesus. So, remember, as we participate in this sacrament, it is an opportunity for you to recommit to follow Jesus, to recommit your life to be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, and to live the life that Jesus would live if Jesus were living your life. So there you have it, these 5 names. Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. Communion, the breaking of bread, Eucharist, the agape or love feast, in the Lord's Supper. So what does this mean for us as a church family? Well, one thing, I really hope that you have a richer understanding of this sacrament, of this holy and sacred and really cool opportunity that Jesus has given us when he said, do this in remembrance of me. I hope that it changes what you think when you practice this every week. Like, I hope you remember that not only are you communing with Jesus, but you are communing with one another. You are a part of something bigger than you. You are a part of the body of Christ. I hope you remember that Jesus was broken for you, but that you in return should offer yourself to be broken to others. I hope that you are filled with gratitude as you celebrate the Eucharist, that you are reminded that your life should be overflowing with thanksgiving for who God is and what he's done for you. I hope that you take care of your sin beforehand so you can celebrate being right with God and right with others when you gather for worship. And I hope that each week you are reminded to recommit your life to Jesus. That's what I hope it changes how you view this sacrament that we practice every week. But I want to give us 2 things to do in light of these 2 names that we've talked about today. The first is I want to put these examination questions back up here. And this is an opportunity for you to pull out your cell phone and not to take a picture of me, but take a picture of the screen. Because here's my kind of homework for you this week, is that before you show up to worship next week, you kind of work through these. Do I have any sin that I need to confess? Actually, you could probably work through these every day, probably multiple times a day, let's be real. Do I have any sin that I need to confess? Is there anything in my life that is out of sync with my discipleship to Jesus? By the way, that question is going to become a lot clearer in the next few months. Just a preview. And then, am I in relational conflict with anyone else in the community? And if you are, make things right. Something in us as followers of Jesus is we think conflict is bad. Jesus was all about conflict. He just never left it unresolved, right? He addressed the situations. If you got something against somebody, talk with them. Make things right. So that's one thing I want you to do. Before you come next week, I want you to examine yourself. Make sure you're right with God and others. And the second, we're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper today. And while unfortunately we're not going to dance coming down the aisle, I want you to, Anne's disappointed, but I want you to think about this whole idea of recommitting yourself to follow Jesus. Now, I don't know when you made a decision to follow Jesus for the first time. If you've never made a decision to follow Jesus, let me just tell you the best decision you could ever make is the decision to follow Jesus. He wants to have a relationship with you. He went to great lengths to have a relationship with you. You are not here today by accident because Jesus wanted you to be here to let you know that he wants to have a relationship with you. And he wants you to follow him. He actually wants to be with you. But most of us in this room, we've already made that decision. But when's the last time that you re-upped your commitment? When's the last time you signed up for another year? When's the last time that you said, I recommit myself to follow you, Jesus? This morning, as we take the bread and we dip it in the juice, I challenge you to recommit to following Jesus no matter where he takes you. To recommit to taking up your cross and denying yourself daily. Pursuing him with your whole being. Why don't you close your eyes? I want to give you an opportunity just to reflect on that. And maybe for you, you need to pray right now. Some of this has sparked a conversation that you want to have with God. You can do that. Others of you, you just need to think on this for a little bit. Do I really want to recommit to following Jesus today? I mean, sure, I want to get to heaven when I die, but following Jesus today? I don't know. I want you to think about that. Remember, this has the opportunity to be the Lord's Supper or not be the Lord's Supper. It becomes the Lord's Supper when it's this covenant recommitment to a relationship with Jesus. So I invite you just to reflect on that for a few minutes. Jesus, thank you for this simple command, which is actually extremely complex, but to do this in remembrance of you. And we want to remember you. I also am so grateful for these 5 names that are used in the New Testament for this practice, because they keep us from putting it in a box and making it what we want it to be. We don't want to make this what we want it to be. We want to make this what you want it to be for us. So this morning specifically, we want this time to be an opportunity for us to recommit ourselves to follow you. And my prayer for this church family is that we would be your followers, that we wouldn't just be Christians, but that we would be followers of Jesus who are committed to being with you, to becoming like you, and to living the life that you would live if you were living our life. We want to recommit to that this morning. We love you. We thank you for all you've done for us. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.